So now we're going to discuss the pharyngeal arches. We've talked about them off and on throughout the course, and now we're going to speak about them very specifically. Additionally, we'll go over the early development of the face. Now, the pharyngeal arches are derived from embryonic gills, and of course in fish they become gills, but in humans they've evolved to become a very wide, numerous number of different structures. I apologize. This is the third time I've recorded this one. Better take this time. At any rate, so the original gills have gone on to become many, many different structures of the human face. And it's really fairly impressive how complex it all actually is. So the number of pharyngeal arches varies from organism to organism. In humans, there are at least 4. The 5th arch doesn't develop in humans, so an arch that develops in other organisms that does not develop in us. And then there is debate, as your book highlights, about whether or not there is a 6th arch. But I will say, in the same breath that your book says that there's debate about this, it then goes on to discuss the derivatives of the 6th arch and goes on to behave generally as if it does exist, so we will too. Now, the arches develop much the same way as many other things in the embryo develop, cranially to caudally. So the first arch, the one closest to the head, develops first, and then moving on down towards the most caudal arch. And this is all occurring between days 22 and 29, so it's a fairly short period of time. Now, when you think about the structure of the pharyngeal arches, you can think about them as a group, the structure of the unit, the pharyngeal arch unit, or individually. When you're looking at them as a group, on the exterior of the embryo, they are surrounded by ectoderm. And on the interior of each arch, you have a core of mesenchyme and neural crest. But on the interior of the embryo, so essentially the back side of each arch, you have an open space that's lined by endoderm. Now, before we go into talking about the pharyngeal arches individually, I thought it was worth just sort of orienting you to the diagram you're about to see. So in the upper right-hand corner, you have a 31-day embryo with a white line sort of slicing through the back of the neck up through the front of the head. That is the cross-section that this next diagram is taken from. So keep that in mind as we go through it. So each individual arch is composed of a cartilage element, which is a neural crest derivative, a striated muscle element, a cranial nerve that will then innervate that muscle, and an artery. And keeping in mind that the cranial nerves are specific to the arch they come from, and they innervate very specifically the muscle from the arch they come from. All right, in addition to pharyngeal arches, we have a couple structures that are associated with them. Pharyngeal clefts, which are on the exterior of the embryo, and they're the depressions in between each arch. The first pharyngeal cleft will go on to become portions of the ear. The rest of them regress and disappear. Pharyngeal pouches are sort of the corollary to the pharyngeal clefts. They're the depression between the arches on the inside of the embryo. And they actually go on to form a variety of structures. The first will become portions of the ear. The second will become the tonsils and adenoids. The third, the thymus and a portion of the parathyroid glands. And the fourth, more of the parathyroid glands. All right, derivatives of the pharyngeal arches. So table 17.1 in your book goes over all the different derivatives in wondrous detail. You do not need to memorize them all. I would like you to know the ones that we highlight in the course of the class and discussion of various syndromes, but you don't need to memorize them all. However, I do think it's worth knowing what kinds of structures pharyngeal arches produce, and that's what we're going to go over here. Keeping in mind that all of these structures are derived in the same ways that we've been talking about all semester for all the other structures that we've gone over, through migration of cells, differential growth, where one section of an embryo is growing faster than another and influencing the development of neighboring sections, regression of tissues, programmed cell death. All of these processes are going on in the derivatives of the pharyngeal arches. So each arch is going to produce an artery, which will go on to join the rest of the circulatory system, and we discussed that in an earlier chapter. Likewise, each arch produces a skeletal element that will go on to form part of the structure of the head or the neck. Now, the muscles that are derived from the pharyngeal arches, there are a lot of them. And if you think about it, human faces can really make a very complex array of facial expressions, and that's all thanks to these muscles. Keeping in mind and remembering that the cranial nerve that's derived from each arch will innervate the muscle that is also derived from each arch. And so that patterning that you see in the embryo, you also see in the adult. And finally, there are the cranial nerves derived from each arch and outlined by arch in this picture. Now, it's worth noting that some structures are actually derived from multiple cranial arches combined. And a great example of that, and the one that your book goes through, is the tongue, which is actually derived from portions of the first 4 arches. All right, the early development of the face. We'll cover more of the development of the face in the next lecture. So the face develops between weeks 4 through 10. And in this picture that you're looking at that we're about to go through, you're sort of looking at the embryo head on. So you were looking into the embryo's eyes if it had any at week 4, which it does not. But there are 5 major structures that go on to the formation of the face, and you can see them all at this particular stage. There's the frontonasal prominence, the 2 maxillary prominences, and the 2 mandibular prominences, which are actually derived from the first pharyngeal arch. And the face is actually going to form by all of these structures moving forward and towards the midline to merge together. So to make a face, you actually you have sort of an empty space that has to be filled, and all these structures are going to come forward to fill it. Also present at this stage is the stomodeum, and the stomodeum is going to be the future mouth. So it's an empty space in between all these prominences and processes that are going to come together. But at this point, it's a blind pouch. It's not continuous with the gastrointestinal tract because the oropharyngeal membrane is still in place, and not until it ruptures will the future mouth actually be continuous with the GI tract. All right, so week 5. Week 5 starts off with maxillary prominences growing larger and growing forward and then towards the midline. So they're going to move towards the midline ultimately to meet. And then in the frontonasal prominence, the ectoderm on the surface of the frontonasal prominence is going to enlarge, and it's going to form 2 sets of placodes, 2 nasal placodes and 2 olfactory placodes. Now, we're not going to talk about the olfactory placode in this class, but we will go into the nasal placodes in just a minute. Finally, in week 5, the oropharyngeal membrane will rupture, which then allows the mouth to be continuous with the GI tract. In week 6, we get the formation of nasal pits. So each nasal pit forms in each nasal placode, 1 pit per placode, so there'll be 2 pits. Okay? They form by invagination, growth into the interior of the embryo, and by the movement of the frontonasal prominence forward. So both of those will extend the length of the pit. And the presence of the pit divides each nasal placode into 2 sections, the medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process. Additionally, the space in between, or the junction of the lateral nasal processes and the maxillary prominences, is called the nasolacrimal groove, and we'll go over that in more detail in the next slide. And then finally, the medial nasal processes are going to meet at the midline themselves, and they will become the nasal bridge and the septum. So you can see the 2 red arrows there showing them coming together. All right, so as we move later into week 7, we see the nasolacrimal groove develop further into the nasolacrimal duct and the lacrimal sac, which are ultimately your tear-producing system. So that's what's going to make tears once you have eyes, which you only kind of sort of have at this stage. From there, we move on to talking about the intermaxillary process. Now, this one's important. It becomes a major portion of a number of the structures of the face. So first, how do we make it? Well, it's formed from the fusion of the inferior tips of the medial nasal processes. Okay, so these green sections here, the upper portions have already fused, but the bottom portions have not. And as they fuse, they form the intermaxillary process. Likewise, the upper tips, the superior tips of the maxillary processes, move towards the intermaxillary process and fuse with it as well. And in the adult, these structures are going to become the philtrum and the primary palate. Additionally, at this stage, we are also making cheeks. The cheeks are created by the fusion of the maxillary and mandibular prominences, so the yellow and the orange. And the degree of fusion you get actually determines the width of the opening of the mouth. More fusion makes for a smaller mouth, less fusion makes for a larger mouth. Naturally, there's a great deal of natural variation there, and certainly a variety of different mouth sizes occur within the range of normal, but you do actually get the occasional syndrome that affects the mouth and affects this fusion and might create an overly large opening of the mouth or a very narrow